So yeah, so that like I mean, the title of this is Bitcoin Native Businesses. I've kind of stolen that title from, I think it's TVP Trammell Partners. They came up with it, or at least they were the first ones that like published that to the web. And so I've kind of stolen it, and I think they're okay with that. Um, I actually was doing just a wee bit of research before the call, Matt, and I noticed a pretty cool little post on your website, and it was stealing someone else's. I think it was Mark Andreessen that first said, "Software is eating the world." And on your website, there's like a white paper, and it's Bitcoin is eating the world.
Yep.
Yeah. So I don't know. I just
Bitcoin
thought
is
that would
eating
be
the
a
world.
complete. Say again.
I said Bitcoin is eating the world.
Yeah. So I thought that would be like a really good place to start. Like Bitcoin is eating the world, and actually from both of you, kind of like maybe explain that. Or I don't know if you want to take it in a different direction, but yeah, maybe just from you, Matt, to start with, like what does that mean when you say Bitcoin is eating the world, and why is it eating the world?
Um, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because at 1031, we're focused on funding Bitcoin businesses. But in practice, like right now, what does that look like? That looks like we're funding, the leading Bitcoin startups that are focused on providing Bitcoin solutions to people that are using Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis. But I think long term, every business becomes a Bitcoin business, right? Because money is one side of every transaction. And uh, my thesis is actually quite simple. I expect Bitcoin to become the reserve currency of the world. I expect it to be used in one way or another in most uh, exchange situations, and I think it's going to be the main treasury asset that businesses hold, that governments hold, that individuals hold. So when you're thinking about is am I a productive member of society? Is my business a profitable business? I think the way you have to look at it is how much Bitcoin is am I making per year? Measure your expenses in Bitcoin, and you should be trying to accumulate Bitcoin long term over time. And that goes across everything. That goes across individuals, companies, and as we're starting to see, governments.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I want to come back to the government bit because this is something I want to get started in Scotland. It's one of the reasons for the project. Alan, what about you? I know it's not your thing. The Bitcoin is eating the world, but
No, no,
can
no.
you
It's
speak to it?
it's very much my thing. I just want to double check with Matt. It was John who wrote that, right? It's John Arnold, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so we have a small team. It's four of us partners: me, Marty, Ben, Jonathan Kirkwood, and Grant Gillum. And then John Arnold is a junior member of our team. He's quite impressive, and he wrote that piece.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, on the basis of that, he definitely is. I don't think I've ever met him. I don't think I've interacted with him, but I remember reading this and not only thinking it was great. I was kind of pissed at you though because I'd always had in the back, just going back to Mark Andreessen's "Software is Eating the World," which is obviously what's being referenced there.
Yep.
That was originally an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I'd always had in the back of my mind, like, one day we'll have "Bitcoin is Eating the World" as an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. So maybe, if we all get enough clout on the back of this bull run, you can get John to revise it, and we can claim that spot. Have you talked about that internally at all?
Yeah, I mean, let's just let our memes be dreams. We'll get
Yeah.
it in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah. So anyway, Bitcoin is eating the world. I kind of, it probably isn't too surprising just given similarities in our roles. I don't feel like I have a huge amount to add to what Matt said, and I don't want to just mindlessly repeat things. The point about every company becoming a Bitcoin company is something that we talk about a lot, in particular when we're pitching, which we are doing now because we've just started fundraising again. And I think this will be interesting to get Matt's take on too, that one of the reasons this comes up so often is that a very obvious concern, accusation, maybe, perfectly well intentioned, not that anybody does this maliciously, but when we are pitching to basically anybody other than a hardcore Bitcoiner, who have separate concerns, but the typical concern from a TradFi prospect is isn't this just ridiculously niche? Like VC is pretty niche to them anyway. If you're looking at, you know, the entire universe of asset allocation that's available, not only is it niche conceptually, but it's a very, very small slice in terms of you look at the dollar amounts that typically go towards every asset class. Within that, you can use the C word, crypto VC is like way, way, way more niche again. And then we have to step in and explain that even though we are a strict subset of crypto VC, we also hate everybody else. And like, they have no idea why. And it's just like the educational effort is enormous. And so rather than coming across as basically, or trying not to come across as basically crazy and just completely losing them, we try to paint a more positive picture of what we're doing and why, which comes back to Bitcoin is eating the world. But I think in particular, exactly as Matt put it, every company will become a Bitcoin company. And so, okay, yes, if you view it from a very kind of fiat, TradFi asset allocation perspective, yes, what we're doing is very, very specific. But the obvious comparison, I think, like this is a cliche now because it's beaten to death, but I think with good reason, though, it's similar to the web in whatever, pick your favorite year in the 90s, right? When it was just taking off in terms of consumer appreciation. At that point in time, it was useful to describe companies as internet companies. It was useful to describe investors, as internet investors. Now, it doesn't matter exactly when that changed, but at some point that changed and nobody does that anymore. And so, yeah, very similarly, we talk about this internally all the time that at some point it won't be helpful to call ourselves Bitcoin investors any longer. And so I think the point, to come full circle, the point at which we stop doing that is when Bitcoin has eaten the world or has eaten a decent chunk of the world.
Nice. Love that. So I didn't actually start with this because I always think this is kind of rubbish to start with, like who everyone is and what everyone does, you know, because I think, you know, people go like yawn and then they turn off, so get straight into it. But I also think it's useful to just kind of quickly give a snippet about who you guys are. So maybe Alan, since you're just on screen just now, can you just give us a wee kind of minute or something like that about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I have kind of two somewhat different reasons, I guess, that people might know who I am. So following from what we were just talking about, co-founder and general partner at a firm called Axiom. We're a venture capital firm focused on the Bitcoin space. That should all sound perfectly familiar given that discussion. Worth flagging, I'm probably at this point, I guess, better known as politely a writer, less so, but also more accurately a shit poster. I did a great deal of Bitcoin Twitter shit posting before, while I was working in TradFi, which I did for a long time, but before making the jump into working in Bitcoin full time. I think those roles are kind of coalescing, but it might never fully happen. So I am wary that a lot of people still think of me as a laser-eyed squirrel, which is what my my trademark profile picture is. So there's that too.
Do you think that'll ever change? That laser-eyed squirrel?
No, I can't now. It would be scandalous.
Yeah.
Alan, do you have a LinkedIn?
I do, sadly. It's so cringe, but it exists.
Is it the laser-eyed squirrel?
No, it's a terrible headshot. It's a good point, actually. I need to get a new one because I just don't look like that anymore.
You really do, actually. You look like 15 or something like that in that photo.
Well, that was my TradFi photo. That was my, I was impressing a whole different class of people back then.
Matt, what about yourself? Give us a minute.
Minute about your background.
Name's Matt Odell. I've been active in the Bitcoin space for about 11 years now. Originally mostly focused on education. I have two Bitcoin shows, one called Rabbit Hole Recap and one called Citadel Dispatch. Recently, what I've been very focused on is three different businesses. OpenSATS, which is a 501c3 charity. We're 100% pass-through. Quickly becoming one of the largest charities in the world focused on supporting open source contributors. So we're sending about $1 million worth of Bitcoin a month to over 200 grant recipients in 40 plus countries. We operate on a complete Bitcoin standard. We hold our entire treasury in Bitcoin and in multi-sig, which is quite powerful. And we run a very efficient, transparent operation. You can find more information at opensats.org. I'm also a partner at 1031. We're a venture firm that operates in the Bitcoin space. I think we are probably one of the largest allocators, if not the largest allocator, to Bitcoin-only businesses, businesses that are focused on accumulating Bitcoin long-term. And we're also currently raising right now. And then I have Bitcoin Park in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a community-focused campus. We have these 2 buildings that are right next to the 2 universities there. And we're very focused on education. We have a lot of companies that work out of that space. We have a lot of open source developers that work out of that space. And Nashville is quickly becoming one of the Bitcoin capitals of the world, partially as a result of that, but also just because of the organic groundswell that has happened there. And as you can see across those 3 verticals, they very much compound on top of each other. They're very complementary, and that is not a coincidence.
Nice. Yeah, selfishly, I want to talk about Bitcoin Park, but can you give me, you mentioned OpenSATS is like, very focused on open source technology, Bitcoin businesses. We've got the title Bitcoin native businesses, but when you look at a business, how do you make it? What does a Bitcoin business look like to you? Is it an open source? Yeah.
So like on the 1031 side, we're focused on funding either profitable businesses or businesses that are aiming to be profitable, right? On the OpenSATS side, it's more open source projects and open source contributors that may never have a path to profitability or any kind of monetization, right? One's a charity, one's an investment fund that's actually trying to make a return for investors. So they're very different from that point of view. But in both cases, the general premise is that I personally find hope in open source technology, and technology that doesn't require permission to use, that isn't controlled by a single individual, that is verifiable and trust minimized. I think a lot of the issues we have with our society is a failure of trust in institutions that have become large and centralized and incredibly trusted. Like, they are central points of failure. So with the OpenSAT side, it's particularly interesting because we do run on a Bitcoin standard, but we're not Bitcoin only. Like, we will not fund shitcoin developers. We don't fund the larger quote unquote crypto ecosystem of developers, but we do fund things outside of Bitcoin. Now, the key tenet is it has to be an open source project. So it's not controlled by anyone and anyone can verify the code. And then the second tenet is they have to accept Bitcoin. We will not pay out dollar-based grants. We will not pay out euro-based grants. And we've actually had zero pushback on that. Like, people are just happy to have a source of revenue that they can rely on, because a lot of these open source contributors, they're leaving their highly lucrative fiat world traditional jobs to focus on open source software, which historically meant that they were just doing it for free and they were committing their time and energy to these projects. And now they can have, a lot of our grant recipients have basically like a 1 year grant or a 2 year grant that is denominated in dollars or euros or whatever their local fiat is. And then we pay them at the monthly equivalent in Bitcoin. So they know, like, okay, I'm going to have 100K per year. I know what I can pay for rent. I know I can feed my family. I can know all these different, I have the certainty there, so I can switch my focus and focus on open source technology. So we've seen this organic movement towards open source. And I think the key missing piece was like reliable funding partners. So whether that's on the 1031 side or the OpenSAT side, we've been trying to solve that problem.
Awesome. Alan, what about yourself? I've heard some of your discussion about this is kind of part of why I got kind of interested in it. We were at the Glasgow Bitcoin event and you kind of talked a little bit about your fund and that kind of thing. But can you just give your own view on that? Like, Bitcoin business, what is it, to you?
Yeah, I think the answer will change. I think it's very dependent on what stage of Bitcoin adoption we're in. We covered that a little bit just before we gave our introductions in the very first question. We have a relatively tight criteria for that at the moment, which we think will change. I mean, that's why I give that context to it. We've I'll say what it is in a second. I can maybe give some examples too, but we've come up with it in large part to avoid what would otherwise, I think, be relatively decent criticisms of just like not really having any standards, being kind of hand wavy, especially if it's coming on the back of, oh, Bitcoin is eating the world. Basically, is like almost everything that Matt and I said before. Like I've heard myself say in the past in pitches, you know, like, oh, money's half of every transaction and so on. And I think it's easy. We would obviously never mean this, but it's easy for somebody else to hear like, oh, so you'll literally just invest in anything. Like your TAM is like any company in the world, because eventually they'll all be taking Bitcoin. So basically, we're trying to avoid that. There's actually two things I'll say, which are we've sort of discovered this while struggling to explain what we want to do. That is, I think it's easier to understand, at least to start with, in the negative. So like, what won't we invest in? And there's two things. One of them won't be surprising at all, which is crypto, right? We're Bitcoin only. We don't invest in crypto companies. The second one is we don't want to invest in companies where, even though they may have a perfectly credible, even amazing investment thesis behind them, their returns are likely to only come from financializing the performance of the asset onto their own balance sheet. Now, just to be completely clear, there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, probably a lot, if not all of those companies that I think fit that classification, but hence which we pass on, will do phenomenally well, right? And I think the kind of the obvious, it's almost a caricature at this point, but the obvious caricature of that is MicroStrategy, right? So we can't invest in MicroStrategy because it's public, but something that fits that kind of mold, we would pass on. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think probably what it all comes back to, though, what all these different reasons would have in common, is that it's just not really our skill set, right? We see ourselves as where we have an edge and where we're ultimately offering a service to the clients of the fund is identifying trends in, let's say, technology and business development. That's kind of VC as a whole. And then obviously for us, we also have this appreciation of Bitcoin. And so we can see where these are intersecting and where things really are just misunderstood and should be valued much, much more highly. The simple fact of Bitcoin itself appreciating and then effectively setting up a corporation to get leveraged exposure to that via whatever their, like dollars for MicroStrategy or whatever else the approach is, we don't really think we have any particular skill identifying that. Partly, I guess, the client could just do that on their own if they wanted to. I'd maybe be a bit harsher and say something like, you could synthetically get that by just leveraging Bitcoin in the first place. Like, you can buy Bitcoin and then do some kind of more complex like fiat borrowing scheme to get roughly the similar exposure. So that's another kind of thing that we don't want to invest in. What we do want to find is companies which are creating a good or service, whatever their product is, not only does benefit from Bitcoin's appreciation just by virtue of the way they're offering the service, likely that at least part of their revenues are going to be in Bitcoin. Could be slightly more indirect. It's just exposure to the growth of Bitcoin or Bitcoin flows of whatever kind. But crucially, the real kind of threshold for us where we do start to get interested is where whatever they are offering is extending the utility of Bitcoin itself. So it's making Bitcoin more useful and almost by definition, therefore, driving adoption. So I think that went on for a while there, but those are like the two things that we try not to invest in. Crypto's kind of obvious. The second one I think is a bit subtler and helps us narrow in on like these companies, whatever it is. And I can go into examples. I realize this has all been kind of intangible, but they're making Bitcoin more useful and enabling more people to use it.
Awesome. And actually, I was just going to ask you, is there one of each I don't want you to pick too many, I don't want to put you in a spot because obviously you've got lots of portfolio companies. You don't want to have a favorite, but if there's
They're
one,
all my favorite. I'm sure it's the same for me.
Great. Nice. I mean, more like just for people that are watching, that are, just trying to get a handle on exactly what you're talking about. Maybe just an example each of a company that looks like a Bitcoin company that you'd want to invest in, that doesn't act a bit like, that isn't like MicroStrategy, that's more aligned with what you just described.
Sure. I tell you what, I'll name a few companies, but I'll give a description of a type of company that we really like to invest in. So I think Neutron Pay, IBEX, and GetBit from our Fund 1 portfolio all roughly fit this. And I'm sure Matt will be able to add a few that 1031 have invested in that we haven't. where basically what the company, so these are all, I think it's fair to say, they're like Lightning companies for the most part. And Coin Corner have some element of this too. They're mainly an exchange, but they're kind of growing in this direction. Where what they're doing is allowing their customers, which are typically business, there can be individuals who use this, but the use case is more compelling for businesses, allowing their customers to do basically the equivalent of correspondent banking, right? It's often thought of as like remittances. I don't really like that characterization though, because it's frankly tiny compared to what the real market here is, which is disrupting correspondent banking. And I don't want to go into too much of a ramble about this, but basically correspondent banking is absolutely horrible. It's extremely expensive. It takes a really long time. Crucially, that is not a conspiracy on the part of any evil bankers. It's just a product of the way fiat works. It literally can't be faster and it can't be cheaper because fiat sucks technically. Bitcoin and Lightning are amazing technically, and you can completely disintermediate this if you set up the way you're wanting to do the transfer, simply using Lightning instead and having exchanges at the endpoints. And the really cool thing about this that links back to, this is extending Bitcoin's utility and enabling more and more people to use it, is that you can use these services with, if you're like on a Bitcoin standard with Bitcoin in mind as your unit of account, but actually you don't need to. Even if you're sending fiat if fiat is basically on both sides of the transaction, like in your mind, you're sending fiat from one country, the recipient is going to get fiat in another. They can still do that if they want to, but it will be faster and cheaper because of inserting Lightning into the middle. So Neutron Pay, IBEX, Coin Corner, a little bit, GetBit, all have that. I'm sure Matt can give some, Matt can show some examples too.
Yeah, I mean, our basic investment rubric is profitable Bitcoin businesses. Whether they're profitable today or they'll be profitable hopefully soon in the future, that is our goal, is identifying them and getting access to supporting them, getting access to those deals. I think first of all, we have a heavy focus on exclusivity. 81% of the funds we've deployed have been exclusive deals. The ones that haven't been exclusive, we often lead the deal. And so one example would be Strike. So Strike, we're the largest investor of Strike. We sit on their board. Strike is available in 101 countries. They're already profitable. They have more licenses than Coinbase, and they have 70 employees, right? And so this fits this rubric of an incredibly lean operation, right? You compare it to something like Block, formerly Square. They have 12,000 employees, and they're available in one country, right? So you try and keep your burn low. You try and keep payroll very low, and your other expenses very low, and you try and boost revenue as quickly as possible, right? This idea of growth at all costs and then monetizing in 10 years is absolutely dead on a Bitcoin standard, because money is incredibly tight and Bitcoin purchasing power increases tremendously. So if you wait 10 years to try and monetize, you're going to get way less Bitcoin in your treasury than you would otherwise. A completely different example would be someone like CoinKite, who are also the exclusive investor in. CoinKite makes some of the best hardware in the space for you to hold self-custody of your Bitcoin. And we see that trend increasing, right? The amount of people that want to hold self-custody. And there's a key thing here, right? Which is, I think a lot of investors, where they really fail and end up burning a lot of investor capital, is on two sides. The first is thinking on a short-term basis, right? Like the usual venture fund, our funds included, work on a 10-year time horizon, right? So we're already incentivized to act in a more long-term way. But an example there would be something like BlockFi, right? BlockFi was incredibly reckless. They were the belle of the ball, right? They had a $4 billion valuation when they blew up. But they were doing this rehypothecation yield business, right? That had tremendous amount of risk. And as a result, they ended up blowing up within a few years. But then you have a portfolio company like Unchained that we invested in that doesn't do rehypothecation, that has a Bitcoin native focus, right? They only interact with Bitcoin. All their loans are over collateralized. And as a result, even in all the chaos that happened over the last few years, where we even saw TradFi banks fail, Unchained didn't have a single loan loss, right? So like some of their users were liquidated, and that's really unfortunate for their users. but the actual providers of capital for those loans never took a hit on a single loan. I don't know if that's ever happened before in loan generating businesses, if there's been zero loan losses. Like, people think we're crazy when we say that. And then the second piece that investors tend to lose a lot of their money is they are not focused on the right time frame for Bitcoin. So like, Bitcoin's going through this adoption cycle, and we're invested in 36 Bitcoin businesses, but obviously all of those Bitcoin businesses are weighted accordingly in terms of risk. And so Strike, for instance, is by far our largest investment. And why? Because at this point in the adoption cycle, the number one product is buy, sell Bitcoin. There's billions of people that don't have Bitcoin and they need access to Bitcoin. It's very easy to monetize. You just charge 100 basis points on a reliable service, and you're able to generate revenue. But then you have things that are farther off on the curve, stuff like CoinKite or stuff like Start9, right, where you can run your own node. And it's important to realize that some of those businesses, they might not have real product market fit for a few years, right? Like, there's some businesses out there that seem like the world I want to live in, the world I want my kids to live in or my grandkids to live in. But the question is, how long will it take before that's actually has an addressable market of billions of people or even hundreds of millions of people? And I think a lot of times, like, people get caught up in this idea that, oh, I want this. This makes a lot of sense under a Bitcoin standard, but then they forget, like, oh, it might take 20 years for that actually to happen.
That's super helpful. You were actually speaking to something. I put in some of the overview of the show, that the benefits. We talk about the benefits of leveraging Bitcoin's principles for growth, and it just sounded like both of you talked to that. It's less so the specific technology, more so like the actual way it makes you do business. It felt like you were talking a lot about almost like good, healthy business principles. Which was really cool. So yeah, that but you mentioned that as about the adoption there, Matt. That really made sense to me. So in terms of people watching this show right now, let me actually say, so this show is brought to you by Bitcoin Works. Bitcoin Works is an idea at the moment. It's nothing more. It's just an idea. In fact, it's not even my idea. It's Alan's idea. So I'm blaming Alan if it doesn't work. Because just a little tiny bit of background, I've told this story a couple of times, is when after I'd met Alan, I was launching some other idea, and it was like a startup studio, and I'm still thinking about this, and anyway, kind of pitched Alan on it, and he said, yeah, I like the idea. Where's it based? Edinburgh. Great. Where is your office? And I was like, well, don't have one. He went, well, you should have one, or something like that. And I can't remember how it came up, but it was just like, look, we should probably have an office. And if you make it happen, I'll probably take an office. So I went off and started doing some meetups, started generating some demand, started listening to people. And what I heard was, yes, do it. And we're in that stage right now, but I'm not like, I'm not just about to open it without, having actual people booked. So it's almost the same. It's like, I'm not just going to start a big business like WeWork. Obviously, wouldn't start a big business like WeWork, but like just build an office and be like, I hope people turn up. It's just not how I'm thinking. I'm not thinking like that. I'm thinking more, right? Okay, let's get the revenue booked. So, with that said, well, I don't know. Do you want to add anything to that? Just about this Bitcoin principles. The principles of Bitcoin being embedded into the business. I don't know if any of you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I can chip in a little bit. Oh, sorry, no, go on, Matt.
Go, Alan. Okay, I'll go. Look, people write like 25-page essays on this, but the core is going back to just sound business dynamics, right? Which is, you just run a profitable business. Like, you should just be running profitable business. Like, fiat over the last 3 decades, 4 decades has completely corrupted the incentives because there's been so much cheap money. I mean, if you look at when A16Z was founded, it was founded in 2010, right when 0% interest rates happened. Like right when there was incredibly cheap capital. So I think you actually have an opportunity cost of Bitcoin. At the end of the day, almost all of our investors are thinking to themselves, why don't I just hold Bitcoin, this highly liquid, saleable, 24/7, 365, truly scarce asset? And our founders are thinking the same exact thing, right? Like if a founder is investing money into their business and they're investing time into their business, that it has a real opportunity cost. And when you look at Bitcoin's performance over the last 10 years, it's like 60% year over year. So it sounds brutal, right? It sounds brutal to say out loud, but if you putting money into a business, whether that's your own business or whether you're an investor, and you can't reasonably have expectations of getting past that 60% year over year hurdle, then you shouldn't open a new office or hire 10 new employees or build out a whole new division of your company. And we just haven't had that incentive structure until, we used to. It's just going back to this idea of running a profitable long-term business and having true opportunity costs where money is not cheap.
Yeah, I've said the following. I've sort of found myself saying it so many times. It's sort of become a meme. I feel like I should get it on a t-shirt now, but I don't even like Bitcoin. I just hate fiat. And I feel like a lot of this is, especially what Matt mentioned right there, really comes down to like a lot about Bitcoin in general. I feel like this comes up in lots of different areas. A lot of it can be framed as shiny and new and very software centric, or even very financial centric in terms of the like novel applications you can get out of it. But a huge amount of it is really, really old. It's just common sense. It's undoing a huge amount of like psychic damage that fiat has sort of forced on everybody and normalized. And so it seems weird and novel by comparison until you have the proper context for it. And yeah, I think Matt's more or less covered this. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I was thinking, I think in a previous answer of Matt's when he was talking about, growth at all cost and, we'll figure out how to monetize later. And obviously that doesn't really work on a Bitcoin standard. It's worth emphasizing that it shouldn't work on any standard. Again, this is one of these things where it's not that this isn't really a Bitcoin centric point. There is an additionally interesting and compelling component with respect to Bitcoin's own monetization and the what that forces your opportunity cost to be. So I don't want to completely dismiss it, but I almost want to give like Matt's given the glass half full, I want to give the glass half empty. Like, I just want to hammer more on how stupid fiat is.
Very Scottish of you, Alex.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Matt's giving the optimistic American outlook. I'm just giving the dour Scottish take. That what we've lived through, and I love the I don't think it would have occurred to me to do it, but I love the highlighting of A16Z is like the sort of the bookend of this. What we've lived through is an investor, or a VC, I should say, a VC calculus for at least, going on 15 years now, where perversely it is actually rational to think of and to embed as your investment philosophy everything that Matt was criticizing. So, we're all criticizing this as like insane out of context, but in context, it does actually make sense because there will always be somebody to buy you out, right? They're always going to print more money, give it to somebody upstream of you, and hence, if you can grow at all costs, then that probably is the best way to get a return on your investment. But it, obviously it makes no sense holistically because someone will always end up holding the bag. And, most people who not even work in VC, but who work in finance, really in any role in finance, who have some, participate in some way in capital allocation on a larger scale, are probably too myopic or are trained to be so myopic as to not realize where these costs are being pushed and how they're being socialized. And I think it's fair, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's fair enough to say that this phenomenon Matt's describing, grow at all costs, we'll monetize later. If it doesn't work, who cares? The portfolios are highly asymmetric, so we just get 1000x and everybody's happy. Those losses are ultimately just socialized with inflation, right? It's kind of hard to conceptualize because it feels like, there's always going to be somebody to bail you out, as if that's going to be like another even dumber VC fund. But it's really like it gets dumber and bigger through VC funds, but then they go public and then it becomes public investors and then it goes on central bank balance sheets. And ultimately it's really just normal people who are paying for this incredibly stupid capital allocation, but 10 years later in the price of milk, rather than, at the moment in your, I was like quoting Svetsky on this. He's like, we don't need another dick pic app, right? Like that's the chain of where the inflation is all pushed. It's initiated with the 20th dick pic app that they've invested in that year, and then it comes out now, or how X many years, decades later, in everything costing more. So that's there you go. That's the Scottish take.
So yeah, no, this is it made me think. I was kind of I put my ears into her. I was trying to wear the ears of some friends of mine. I've got some friends in like typical traditional finance, people just in other types of roles, businesses. And one kind of question I have for myself, and I still haven't fully answered this yet because it's just kind of wait and see, is the types of businesses that would actually come together and be part of like a Bitcoin ecosystem. So maybe actually this is a question for Matt, because this is how we got chatting, and I was super interested to hear some of Matt's feedback in this, and share as much as you want, Matt. You don't have to share everything, but so Bitcoin Park. Tell me a little bit about Bitcoin Park and how that started, what it is, how it started, and how it's going.
Well, I mean, I think what a lot of us realized during the insane global response to COVID, was how important interpersonal connection was, like actual physical personal connection, right? Governments around the world tried to push us all onto like Zoom calls to talk to people, right? And there was this phenomenon that a lot of fiat VCs, for instance, were pushing with this idea of just no in-person workplaces, right? There'll be no offices in the future. Everyone will just be like in their Apple goggles, in a virtual workspace with their coworkers. And I think Bitcoiners radically pushed back against that. We saw, particularly in America, we saw this organic viral growth in in-person meetups that happened all throughout COVID. While other meetups and offices were closing and other meetups were struggling to get people in the door, Bitcoin meetups were growing at like a record pace, right? And this phenomenon was also happening in Nashville, Tennessee. And our meetups during COVID, our meetup grew to 180, 200 people a month.
Wow.
And then a little over 200 people a month. And we were just in a brewery, right? We were in just a great brewery, but a great local brewery that was hosting us on a monthly basis. And we had overgrown that basically. And so we were like, we need to find a new space. And of course, being crazy Bitcoiners, we were like, well, why don't we have our own space, right? Let's have our own space 24/7, 365 that we have full control over. And that's how Bitcoin Park was born. Since then, I think Bitcoin Park we've been going for about like 2.5 years now. And we do have our basic model is a membership model. So we have over 100 members that pay annual dues to support the park, and we have a couple companies that also support the park with annual dues, and that also gives us some security on our spend and our actual burden. But I would say that it was definitely not purely profit driven, right? Which is ironic given given this previous conversation. A lot of it had to do with, I think local strong communities are incredibly important. I think as we go from this transition from inflationary fiat controlled currencies into a sound, open, global Bitcoin standard, it will get messy. And I think Bitcoin is the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that local communities will make that transition much better. And then, of course, it's just very complementary to what 1031 does. So there's a lot of indirect benefits to 1031 in terms of meeting potential investors, but also founders and having companies work out of that space and interact with each other, right? When you have a portfolio of 36 businesses that all operate on the same open interoperable protocol, the ability for collaboration, and I know this is like classic VC speak, like I hate the word synergy, but the potential for collaboration is higher than it's ever been, more so than anything you see in in traditional tech. because these companies having those founders and having those teams all work together in the same place really fosters that connection.
Amazing.
Robbie, can I follow that just to? I think it's super interesting to compare the experience in Edinburgh with what Matt's described in Nashville. Somewhat optimistically, I'd like to think, because kind of charting how it's gone, it seems like we're clearly behind, right? But we're maybe not all that far behind. And I think, having lived through some of the same things and seeing what the reaction was is actually makes for a really interesting contrast. So people probably know this anyway, but I've lived in Edinburgh for most of my adult life. I've been in Bitcoin for actually longer than that. So, there was a good 6-7 years of there basically being nothing here as far as I could tell. I was just told people like, oh, I live on the internet. I don't live in Edinburgh. I just live on Twitter mainly. In October 2022, there was a fantastic conference in Edinburgh. I really have no idea how they managed to pull off doing this so well, and sadly it hasn't happened since. I think they wanted it to become an annual thing, but then maybe I did hear this story once. I don't mean to speak for them. I think like the FTX blow up just made it impossible for them to get the sponsors to cover it, blah blah blah. Anyway, it happened once, it hasn't happened since. But it was really, really good, and like for a first time conference, incredibly impressed with how well run it was, who they managed to get to. Like Adam Back was there, Jose from Ibex, Larry Lepard, Greg Foss. I could go on and on, but like it was very, very well done. Really nice venue. Everybody had a good time. What I think the legacy of that conference though was far more important than the event itself, because on the one hand, this is what made me think of it actually with Matt describing the meetup in Nashville and not just its growth, but why it seemed to grow. Thinking about that timing, October 22, that was basically in the UK at least. That was kind of finally coming out of COVID insanity. Unfortunately, it lasted a lot longer here than it did there,
Right.
Matt. And so there were a lot of people. I would expect this to be a pretty, like, for this to sound familiar for a lot of people who are listening to this, regardless of where they live in the world. There were a lot of people who came to that conference who had basically been like locked in their homes for 2 years. Who met in real life for the first time and were just incredibly surprised to discover that their Twitter friends actually live super close to them or like down the street. And so, yeah, like I was saying, the legacy of this conference, I think, is much more important than the event itself, because the Edinburgh Bitcoin meetup span out of that. And there's no official connection between the people who ran it, but in the sense that we realized there were enough people to do it because we all met at this conference, and in this kind of sense of celebration and relief that we're allowed to see each other in real life again. And then I'll maybe even actually kind of hand it over to you here, Robbie, that I very much get the sense, obviously not to downplay your efforts in getting Bitcoin Works off the ground, but if, touch wood, when Bitcoin Works is up and running, that'll very much have been a consequence of the meetup too, because that's how we figured out that there even are enough people. So it's really nice hearing Matt talk about how it happened in Nashville, because I think and again, I don't mean to speak for you in terms of how you're planning on running it, but yeah, that experience there and just seeing how well you can keep the momentum going, I think is really hopeful for what we want to happen here too.
Yeah. I'm going to say, like, I actually, my Bitcoin journey actually started a long time ago, but it only really got going at the start of this year when I joined a Bitcoin walk. So a friend of mine, and you've probably heard of them, Matt, and I know you have, Alan, started in Edinburgh and, just turned up walking and talking. And it was just the best way to sort of like get really comfortable with the idea and to then take it further myself, so just for that reason it's really, really helpful. But I want to know a bit more about the Bitcoin Park space, Matt, and in particular, because I don't think we're just behind Alan with, like, I don't know, Bitcoin Juju, like the vibe. I think we're quite behind from a regulatory point of view as well. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah,
the UK, we've got a lot of catch up to do.
To the point where I don't even think about that. So I kind of envy that Matt does or is able to.
Right. And so this is something that's really like it comes up often. So I've been doing these meetups every week, and there's chaps that are turning up from like NatWest that run like program management for like with a 40, 50 million budget, and they're coming down. They're going, why aren't we doing Bitcoin mining? Why aren't we? Why isn't someone capturing that stranded energy in the north of Scotland where we've got tons of windmills literally doing nothing because they've overspent on them? And I think it comes down to regulation and just a lack of knowledge. And so I suppose one of the reasons for Bitcoin works is to bring a focus to Bitcoin so that we can kind of bring people together. And I know you've had some success with that, Matt, or at least that was one of the reasons Bitcoin Park kind of prospered, maybe.
Well, I mean, look, like I said, it's a little bit, Bitcoin Park's a little bit odd, right? Because, like Bitcoin Park is not something that with my 1031 hat on, I would ever invest in. So it's more ideologically driven. And my partners over there, Harry and Rod, like we basically just all took out a pocket and just jumped off the cliff on this thing, with the idea that we might not ever recoup the Bitcoin that was used to jumpstart it. And why is that important? That's important because anyone who's been to Bitcoin Park knows that it's probably the single nicest physical Bitcoin space around the world. I don't pretend we created this concept of a physical Bitcoin space. But I think we took it to another level where people that are operating other physical Bitcoin spaces around the world are like, holy shit, this is incredibly high end. It's incredibly large. It's in a bustling, growing, extremely strong area of Nashville, which itself is a booming city. Like I said, we're right near the universities, which is incredibly important, I think, to bring young people into the space. And all of this kind of came together and it ended up in this result that, I think, first of all, I'm a big grassroots guy, right? So it's one of the reasons Bitcoin Park exists. But you got to start local, right? You start local and you build your way up. Like local is where you have the strongest foundations. It's where it's easier to have those interpersonal connections. And so, like our local policymakers, we're very, very happy to have Bitcoin Park in Nashville, and they mostly sought us out. They sought us out because they saw this booming campus that seemed to pop up out of nowhere, and this physical connection. Right? It's a lot easier to realize that Bitcoiners aren't crazy people when you walk into a very high end physical space. Right? You're like, oh shit, these people. At the end of the day, these government officials do like they're tax slaves. These people are like going to be nice, high paying taxpayers. They're going to drive business and opportunity in my state, and they're going to provide a lot of opportunity. And they started coming in big ways, right? Or just organically. And we were very responsive to that. And we worked with them very closely. And this vision of Nashville, we like to call it Sovereign Valley, right? So you have Silicon Valley and then we're Sovereign Valley, where freedom tech is blossoming. And they want that to be a part of their history. They want that to be a part of their career paths and the opportunity for their local people. Now, obviously, in America, we already had an advantage, I think, on the regulatory front. It's easy if you're in America to be like, damn, like there's way too much regulatory burden, and I wish people were more open to innovation. But then you look globally and you realize that we have pretty solid property rights. We have relatively low regulation compared to the rest of the developed world. And then obviously Trump just took the presidency. So like we're basically off to the races. We're off to the races over here, but it like anything else in Bitcoin, like it took lots of proof of work, right? And it didn't just start at the founding of Bitcoin Park, but even Bitcoin Park, is now 3 years in, and we grinded it out during a generational bottom, like a very brutal bear market that was brought on by FTX and just the global macro environment. So we're starting to see the results pay off from that in a very big way.
Right, and I think this is something because you mentioned this a couple of times, Matt, that you've got OpenSATS and you've got Bitcoin Park, and kind of strangely or ironically, they don't operate in the same way as you would normally want to operate a business. Like they're not profit driven. But they are actually really important because they're kind of like building the ecosystem. So they're kind of like an investment, but it's just difficult to attribute the value from that investment. It's just one of those ones.
Yeah,
So yeah.
there's two pieces there, right? First of all, on the OpenSAT side, I think if you're building on open protocols and open source software, and if you rely on Bitcoin, right? There is a I would say direct incentive, but a lot of people would say indirect incentive to support the open source contributors that are building out the protocols and the tools that your business relies on. MicroStrategy is fucking worthless if the core developers aren't supported. And so that's very unique, right? Like usually, Nestle doesn't have an incentive to fund water wells in Africa because they're one of the largest water distributors in the world. If anything, they have the opposite incentive, right? They want to control water supply and they want to provide bottled water because you have horrible water sources. But in Bitcoin land, like a Strike or an Unchained or a CoinKite, like actually has a pretty strong incentive to support the open source contributors. And myself as someone who heavily relies on Bitcoin, my whole family relies on Bitcoin. The companies we invest in rely on Bitcoin. It's an incredibly valuable use of my time. Now, Bitcoin Park is probably a little bit harder indirect sell, but in terms of that, but I think there's also there's a very strong alignment that can happen for companies and individuals in terms of having a very good, strong physical meeting space where they can collaborate, but also we've seen stuff like company offsites, right? And that provides value back to those companies. So it's not just do something for a good cause, right? I think usually incentives break down if you're just asking for benevolence. The whole reason Bitcoin appealed to me in the first place was because instead of so many institutions that our society relies on, it doesn't rely on this concept of benevolence. It relies on just straight greed. Like Bitcoin gets more robust the more greedy people are. And I try and have that lens on pretty much everything I do.
Just on the open source point, by the way, I saw this tweet when I was doom scrolling last night, and knowing I was coming on here and was going to see Matt, I saved it. So I hopefully I can get a chuckle out of Matt from this, right? So it says, it's not about Bitcoin to be clear, but I think the connection is probably in the context of what Matt just said, it's even more powerful. So the most consequential figures in the tech world are half guys like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and half some guy named Ronald who maintains a Unix tool called Runk, which stands for Ronald's Universal Number Counter and handles all math for every machine on Earth.
Exactly.
Nice. So, by the way, I don't know if anyone noticed, we got a question in from the live chat. I don't know if anyone wants to, I don't know if it's worthwhile answering that just now, or even just this. I think it was actually talked a bit to your point about the adoption cycle, Matt. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it? The question?
Yeah.
I think the first part's more relevant. I don't know about the second part, but the first part's maybe worth answering. It was just, yeah.
You want to read the question?
Yeah. Do you want me to read it? Or do you want to read it?
No, read the question so that people who are listening, they know what the question is that we're answering.
Will do. Do you think this cycle could be different for medium of exchange and merchant adoption?
What do you think, Alan?
I really don't know. I kind of want to just reject the question. I've always been kind of put off. It's like rejecting the framing of the question. I think you'll probably agree with this, Matt. Well, if you don't, we can get a good argument going. That'd be fun. I don't like this framing because I feel like it's accepting a very inherently kind of fiat, I guess, but it's almost more academic. It's like Keynesian monetarist synthesis of what money is, and therefore Bitcoin isn't money because it doesn't fulfill these definitions. Basically, I cringe whenever somebody forces whatever we're seeing in the real world through this lens of unit of account, store value, whatever the other one is, the one about paying.
Medium of
And
exchange.
I have this joke about it that I wrote this somewhere, I don't even remember where, but it's that whole argument is semantics, therefore reality. So I just kind of, I know this question isn't being asked in that way, but it's like, it's accepting a framing that I think comes from that way of thinking about it. And so the way that I've always imagined that this will start to change is it basically requires kind of freeing yourself from thinking that it has to go through these phases and like fulfill these discrete, allegedly unrelated roles. The way I think you see this start to change is that merchants simply don't accept fiat anymore, or if they do, they force you to pay more if you're going to buy something with fiat. They add like I don't know how they communicate it exactly, like a Bitcoin discount or a fiat premium, or they just reject fiat. And I think crucially, one, there's like a market that kind of, somewhat abstract terms. There's a market that people often overlook in discussing this kind of thing, probably just in broader economics, frankly, but the labor market, that there will be people who won't work unless they're being paid in Bitcoin. And that will force the hand of employers. And I mean, I have no idea if we're like how close we are to that. But then the other thing that I think this is a separate point, but it follows on from that and is yet another reason to reject that framing, is that it seems completely obvious to me that this isn't going to happen all at once. It's not like, we're just waiting for some or other characteristics to be fulfilled. And then, finally we can all declare that Bitcoin is in fact a medium of exchange. Like if you demand that you want to see things through that, through that lens, there are people right now, and I mean, for all I know, there's probably been people for like 10 years for whom Bitcoin fulfills all three of those functions. And it depends, what exactly their highly local economic activity is that allows them to do that. And so this idea of like, again, I'm being harsh because it is, the question isn't really framed this way, but it's just, it like triggered me. The idea that, you can just definitively say it for Bitcoin as a whole or for the world as a whole, it just kind of irks me. It's like, I want to think, I want to have an Austrian perspective, basically. I want to think, locally, per methodological individualism, the actions of thinking individuals, affecting prices on the margin and not with like top down statistics. So I guess the answer is like, I don't know. So Matt, what do you think? Do you know?
Look, I think there's been a lot of false starts on people expecting Bitcoin being used as actually a transactional currency, like years and years and years. Like we've seen, I got involved with Bitcoin like 11 years ago. And even then, right, it was like, let's get Microsoft to accept Bitcoin or whatever. And it was like very like forced. It was extremely forced and it wasn't organic. Now I think good money is and then so then there was backlash about that. And then we kind of went to the full extreme where there's a lot of people that are like, oh, Bitcoin is just a store of value asset. And then people will spend, dollars or euros or whatever. And, the Saylor thesis of the world is like, you just borrow against that. And then I guess you use a shitty currency to make your payments. Now, I think really you need both. You need to be able to spend without permission and you need to be able to save without permission. It's not one or the other. Now, the question becomes, how much, like where we are in that adoption cycle. And I think what happens is like slowly over time, like more and more people will predominantly save in Bitcoin and predominantly spend in Bitcoin. But it's something that's going to take time. It's going to be organic. It's going to be a little bit more grassroots than maybe people want it to be. It comes down to like actually merchants wanting to hold Bitcoin. I think it's not going to be led by merchants that are automatically converting in the background, because if they're doing that, that means they already have access to TradFi rails and they'll probably just accept Apple Pay, which, if you have access to Apple Pay, is a dramatically better UX than Freedom Money, because it's incredibly centralized and controlled, and centralized things tend to have better UX. But I think we're starting to see glimmers of it. I mean, I will say myself personally, I try and live as much on a Bitcoin standard as possible. My family's savings are in Bitcoin. So if I can't pay in Bitcoin somewhere, that means I have to convert it myself, which adds friction to my life and mental burden to my life. So if I can spend in Bitcoin, I will always spend in Bitcoin. And if I can't, I won't. And I think that's happening to more and more people. And I will say that one really positive thing that the blue check class of Bitcoiners is ignoring is Nostr is a circular economy already. A Bitcoin circular economy that uses, there's three pieces, right? Store of value, medium of exchange, unit account. Nostr uses all three. Like, it doesn't say like, oh, I've zapped you, I've sent you, $1 worth of Bitcoin. It says I sent you 1,000 sats, right? It is the unit of account. And there's the circular economy happening, and it's partially what Alan said, I think, which is this is a use case that's just not possible with dollars. There's no way that I can send a stranger dollars on the internet in an interoperable way, but I can do that very easily with Lightning and with Bitcoin. So as a result, you literally have no choice. Like, if you want to do, if that's something that interests you, sending strangers money on the internet for shitposts, like, you have to use Bitcoin. You have no other choice. And yes, Nostr adoption is low, but so is, using Bitcoin as a transactional currency. So I could see quickly the number one use of Bitcoin as a transactional currency in number of payments, not in volume. So like discounting super high value large payments is going to be Nostr. And we're already starting to see that with, Strike powers one of the largest Nostr clients in the world, Primal, which 1031 is also an investor in. And a large portion of Strike's daily payments are Nostr. Now, not the volume. The volume is still negligible because people are sending, 10 sats, 100 sats, 1,000 sats. But the number of actual payments is substantial and significant.
This makes me think about some questions that came up in one of the meetups. One of the chaps came and he's thinking about setting up a BitDev meetup as part of our regular weekly meetups for Bitcoin Works. And he's getting involved, and he's getting, he's looking at companies to kind of go work for. You've mentioned Strike a few times, and it makes sense. It's like buying and selling Bitcoin. That's where we are right now. But you also mentioned this idea, which still to this, I think it'll always constantly fascinate me, is the kind of the incentive structure that's built into Bitcoin that makes like selfishness a good thing. Because it just kind of like, I suppose, keeps everyone on an even keel. Everyone knows what everyone else's intentions are. It's to grow Bitcoin, make it as high value as possible, and get as much of it as possible. But just grow it. Everyone wants to make it better. And so if you are in that mindset, what protocols, what products could you start with? Not like, okay, we're going to go and build a unicorn. I actually don't like that term anymore, and I think that people have stopped using it because it is just such a fiat dream. But businesses that I suppose are not, they wouldn't necessarily need charity. Okay, but something that's going to maybe make one developer, two developers some money, and then they could go from there. They can build from there and then get part of the ecosystem. Are there any kind of, Nostr is obviously an amazing protocol, and I know that like there's some cool apps on that. I looked at one recently. Is it Mostro? It's like a decentralized marketplace.
Yeah.
I think they were speaking at Riga, and that looked really cool.
So RoboSats is similar in that respect too. But once again, by the way, that's buy sell Bitcoin, and you just add a fee on top, which is the product with product market fit in the Bitcoin space. Everything else, more or less, is trying to lean into the adoption cycle and be creative and see where the puck is going, than rather where the puck is today. With the exception of maybe a few other financial services, but even something like lending against your Bitcoin right now is primarily people trying to arbitrage tax policy, rather than like trying to use that credit to grow a business. So I think it looks like I lost you. So we'll see if you come. I think I'm back now. I lost you momentarily.
Lost you just for a second there, yeah.
Nope.
You're back.
I see Alan. Okay, we're back now?
I can hear you.
I lost you guys.
Yeah, you're back.
Look, I think on the Nostr front, just to pull back to Nostr again, I think most things in Nostr are non-investable right now. But it's more of something that I want to see how I think it's incredibly important for our world that we have a open protocol for speech and communication that's verifiable, that doesn't require permission. I think more and more of our lives are digital. And if we're relying on these centralized, trusted institutions to provide that capability for us, we're going to have a really bad time. I think Primal specifically is, you know, our check to Primal is weighted accordingly, and they're trying to be like the mainstream Nostr client. So if Nostr does take off, they should be able to do decently well. But once again, they're not trying any kind of crazy business model. Like their goal is they're going to add premium, they're going to add some business tools on top, and they're going to try and offer some premium experiences. And then they also offer buy sell Bitcoin, which once again is, you know, the thing that has real product market fit. I would say that Primal to me is interesting from the perspective that I think these fiat VC incentives have set us up in a situation where like the best business model is like a low integrity, horrible for the society business model, which is essentially corporate data surveillance, right? Which is like you don't have users, you have products, and the users are your product, and you're trying to get them addicted to your platform or whatever that is, and then you're trying to milk out as much data and control over them as possible, and then you sell them to ad businesses. And Primal is trying to do things differently in that way, and Nostr in general is trying to do different things in that way. And I think also most of the businesses we invest in are like trying to reset the playing field where your users aren't your product. Your users are your users, and you're providing them a valuable service. And as a result, they are paying you for that service, and you are reaching profitability. And I think a lot of that won't necessarily go away under the data surveillance stuff probably won't go away under a Bitcoin standard, but there's opportunities here to make significant money in a much more ethical way that just weren't possible before we had a global interoperable money that's just open.
Nice.
Yeah, can I just push that a little bit further? I think that I'm trying to think exactly how to frame this, because I think it's like basically can't fail to be true. I'm just not sure if there's like a better way of articulating that, but if you're, maybe something will come to me as I'm describing it. If you are building a product or a service that is in some way very much linking back to what I described as like something we want to invest in, right? As extending the utility of, in that context, it was Bitcoin, but you can throw Nostr into this. I'd actually say it's probably worth breaking out like Lightning separately too. Whatever it is, if it's fundamentally about extending the utility of something that to start with is free and open source software, and probably crucially a protocol as well. I think that's essential to what I'm about to describe. Your incentives are very, very different to, you call it like Web 2 or, you know, the Silicon Valley meme that's infected the way that apparently all VCs think, and actually go right back to Matt's, you know, Matt citing it, not Matt coming up with it, growth at all costs. And, you know, if you're not the, I forget the expression, but, you know, you're the product. The product is free, the service is free, the product is you, and all that stuff. If you're building on Bitcoin or Lightning or Nostr or whatever it is, you can go that route if you want to, but it seems almost, this is what I was kind of struggling to articulate, and I'm still not coming up with anything good. It seems unavoidably true that by doing so, you're degrading your own service, right? The only way that you can not only provide a good service to begin with, but kind of downstream of that, hope to build a sustainable business is by consistently providing value and making that open source protocol even more valuable than it would be otherwise, you know, if the users had to interact with it directly. And I think that threat is very, very healthy and almost pro-social in a way, because it doesn't at all mean, you hear a lot of like, I guess, criticism, like flack externally from people who, external, let's say, to the Bitcoin ecosystem, often from crypto in a lot of cases too, because they don't understand this at all. This is probably their biggest sin in terms of the essential affinity scam there, that, you know, you somehow need to, in order to build business at all, you need to lock in the users, right? Because if you're not doing that, then basically what you're doing is just charity, right? And you only have these two options, right? And this is something that's very much inherited from Silicon Valley. I would argue even that is downstream of fiat, and we kind of covered that before. It wasn't the case necessarily with Web 2. If you want to think of Web 2 as like building on HTTP basically as a protocol that is all built around. It wasn't the case that you couldn't just take this more free and open source software centric approach. It's just that if you did, it was very likely you'd be crushed by somebody leaning into the contrary, more fiat dynamics of it. Whereas now, what's really, really healthy about people who are building in this space or across these different interlinked spaces is that should you try to do that, you'll probably lose because somebody else can offer arguably as good a service, but without trapping the users on the basis that the ability to just access the underlying protocol is always there in the first place. So your business model, the longer term your outlook and the more sustainable you want it to be, the more you have to have in mind that you can't trap users. You need to consistently be providing value for them.
Yeah, there's no moat. If you're using interoperable protocols, open protocols, there's no moat, and that's the key. Like I just go back to my metaphor, right? Because I think metaphors are incredibly powerful. Like if the users of these Web 2 platforms are data cattle, right? It's like, what do you need to run a cattle farm? Like you need fences around the cattle. Otherwise, you lose your cattle, right? And so what we've seen is these walled gardens pop up. But in Bitcoin and in Nostr and other companies that are building on open protocols, the switching costs are quite low. So if you start acting against your user's best interest, they will switch to something else, and it keeps everyone honest and it keeps the incentives much more user aligned.
Nice. So I want to ask this question because it's definitely selfish, and because we're all okay with that, that's allowed. Bitcoin Works is going to be hopefully a space for Bitcoiners, but I would say probably almost a larger part of the mission is to incentivize or encourage more people to kind of get involved that don't normally associate Bitcoin with, like, I don't know, sustainable business. I don't know like that word, but some like real business. It's kind of like Ponzi, all these different words people associate it with it. And so what I'm interested in, though, I suppose, Alan, and you, Matt, maybe Matt more because you've got the Bitcoin Park element, is that almost like interface between people who are already sort of absolutely fully on board with Bitcoin, and then there's some people on the periphery, but then there's some people and businesses that are just like, yeah, this is just not for me. But like trying to create a space that's open for business, if you like, or open for everyone and accessible for everyone. And what I'm interested to know is, because this is something I'm thinking about, is how to create that space. Because it's easy, it almost feels easy to just like mark, it's going to be called Bitcoin Works, so obviously it's in the name already, but it's like, how do you make that open and accessible for other people to come in, and is that even worth it? or should you just wait for people to get it and then they can come in?
I mean, look, I think physical spaces they very much ride or die on the operator. They're very operator-driven businesses. And I mean, I guess that's the case for pretty much all business, particularly as startups, right? It's like it mostly comes down to that founding team and how they execute and where their priorities lie. But I think particularly in physical spaces, like it's going to come down to you, Robbie, because you're going to be like the first touch point for a lot of people with Bitcoin Works. And I think the difficult key aspect here is you have to have a really welcoming environment where there's like no questions or dumb questions, because you'll have a lot of people that come in and that are just Bitcoin curious, that see Bitcoin in the name. Mm-hmm. Maybe they have a local business. I think a lot of local businesses, by the way, benefit a lot from something like Bitcoin Park, because they're just trying to see like how they can grow their small business, and Bitcoiners tend to have a lot of disposable income and are very excited about things that otherwise seem mundane. So like it rejuvenates them a lot. We've had a lot of non-Bitcoin businesses that are local, particularly like their owners become members of the park and want to be around Bitcoiners and want to learn more. But then at the
Mhm.
same time, you have to be an absolute asshole to like crypto people and scammers, because if you
Right.
so you need to be welcoming, but at the same time you have to be, you know, judge, jury, and executioner on the people that are trying to come into your space and sell scams to unsuspecting newcomers that are maybe too naive. And that's the hard line to balance. But I think you can pull it off. But I literally just rides or dies on you and how you handle that situation.
Wow, that's so funny because that's exactly the thing that I'm thinking about. It's already happened a couple of times, just in the Telegram group and in some of the meetups, and it's that, that's kind of like where I'm thinking is, you know, it's kind of a hard line for that in particular, but then welcoming and yeah, like events and just again one more question selfishly, like what would you say the most successful event that you put on at Bitcoin Park was, and why? What made it so successful?
So we
What
have
like was it? Yeah.
we have two main meetups, right? So we have one meetup that's BitDevs, which is based on a framework that was originally started in New York, and now there's BitDevs all around the world. That's like this month from in Bitcoin from a developer perspective, and it's Socratic, and there's no pictures, and it's Chatham House rules, so you can talk freely, but it's very deep on Bitcoin, right? So like these are like ride or die Bitcoiners. And then we have a social meetup that is literally just one high level panel with high integrity Bitcoiners that we curate. And then the rest is just social. It's just food and drink, right? Like people can network. And that social meetup is the foundation of Bitcoin Park, right? It's very welcoming. And the number one thing we do is every time we have that meetup in the beginning, we go through the ground rules, which is don't take pictures of people without their permission. This is a Bitcoin only meetup. Feel you're welcome to have your own ideas or interests or whatever, but take that to some other place. We're not here to talk about NFTs. We're not here to talk about ICOs or any of that stuff. And you keep repeating it, because then what happens is the community enforces it, right? Like we had Preston come to a meetup like 2 years ago or something like that, and he in the back of the room he like took a picture, and before of everyone he did like the wide sweeping picture, and before we even realized, within like 2 minutes, like people were replying to him on X, and they were like, dude, you got to delete this photo, like you're not allowed to have this photo up or whatever. So it takes some of the pressure off you by doing that repetition and having your community enforce it. But then also you're just gonna have bad actors. Like you're just gonna have to put the foot down. And it's not just crypto stuff. Like especially in a Bitcoin bull run, right? Like this, I think this bull run is gonna be absolutely insane. You're gonna have people like trying to sell development like land and shit to your members and to the people that are there. Like they're gonna be trying to sell everything. Like here, some just scams that you can't even really comprehend. They're just completely outside of it, just because they believe you have high value targets that are, the people with disposable income that are coming to your place, and that's just hard. It's more of an art than a science, but you just have to kind of be a dick sometimes.
Good advice. Good advice. Appreciate that. So, yeah, guys, I don't want to hold like I think this has been so good so far, and I don't want to like make it too longer than it needs to be, because I'd love to do it again sometime, But I don't know. One question I want to ask you both is, what is the thing right now that you're like? And by the way, it doesn't have to be about Bitcoin. Might be, probably is. But what is the thing right now that each of you are like super like excited about, motivated with, like getting involved with? And I mean, like, yeah, totally anything professional, personal. I see a piano in the background, Alan. I don't know if you're doing a lot of that recently.
Can that be my complete cop out of an answer, given I got that like a month ago?
Shouldn't have given him it.
Learning tunes for the bull market. That's what I'm getting into.
That's good enough. That's good enough. What? Any good tunes? Any? What's
Um,
you learning anything
I
new?
mean, it wasn't serious, so now I need to come up with more. I'll tell you what, though, no, I can spin this into a somewhat serious answer. I don't know if people know this about me, but this is going right back to my introduction as like, okay, yes, I have this business that I attempt to run seriously, but also I'm a semi-professional shit poster. Last bull market, I well, I wasn't the only person who did this, but I think I probably had the most influence. I popularized the Surfer Jim song on the basis that I think it started off as a poem. Then somebody whose name I forget did it as this like actually really, really good, like better than mine, really good sort of country ballad. And then, but it was at the exact same time that the ridiculous sea shanty craze was taken off on TikTok. So then I remixed it. I say remixed, I just like got a guitar and did it. But I remixed it as a sea shanty, and then that became like the big thing. And then Bitcoin Miami 21, everyone was singing these sea shanties. So I could learn that on the piano. That's where I was going with all that.
Nice, awesome, love it. How about you, Matt?
I think, I mean, on the technical side, I'm most excited about right now eCash and Nostr. These two new, well, eCash is like an old idea brought back to Bitcoin. But these two, they're interoperable protocols that are incredibly complementary to Bitcoin. And what's cool about them compared to Bitcoin is that they can move fast and break things because there's no consensus like Bitcoin. So it's a way for me to still be focused very much on Bitcoin when I'm looking at those things, but also have like a breath of fresh air that it's not like this big behemoth reserve currency interoperable money protocol of the world that is very conservative and hard to change as a default value prop of it, right? But ironically, neither of those really have strong investable opportunities. A lot of my focus there is on the OpenSATS side in terms of actual like charitable grants out to those things. I think they end up being knock-on massive benefits to portfolio companies in 1031. And then on the 1031 side, I mean, we had the first Bitcoin election in history, period. This was the Bitcoin election. We have the first president that is putting in Bitcoin policy people, right? And a lot of them are people we know. So I think there's big changes coming on the American side and specifically on the regulatory side. One of the things on VC that we've been having a lot of issues with was the previous administration was really against M&A, and this should open it up significantly in terms of that. And we just had our first company go public with Grid. They went public, and then they just did a merger with CleanSpark, and then Fold's about to go public. We helped them navigate that. So I think this is kind of like Bitcoin is very much maturing. Like we're growing up. I mean, one of the coolest parts about Bitcoin to me was that as a young person, there was no one with like 15 or 20 years experience that I was competing with. There was like no graybeards. But like this is the cycle where we become the graybeards, like this is the cycle where like there's like it just everything just levels up in a really big way. And I'm excited for the unknown and the trajectory that we're going.
Awesome. That's a great point to finish on. I don't know if you want to add anything, Alan, to
No,
that.
I can't top that. Don't make me follow that.
That's awesome. Look, lads, thank you so much. This has been really, really fun and really helpful as well. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, cheers.
And
we should try and we'll do it again. We'll look back and we'll do it again in like a year or something like that.
We'll do it from Bitcoin Works. We'll do it from the podcast studio, right?
There we go. Nail it. By the way,
let's do it.
Edinburgh. I don't know how to pronounce it. Whatever. I'm a filthy American.
We'll teach you offline. Don't worry.
One of my favorite cities that I've ever traveled to. It's a beautiful, incredibly underrated city. So I'm excited to see a stronger Bitcoin community.
We're leaning into that and trying to Bitcoinize it. So you can do an RHR from the studio at Bitcoin Works one day.
Lock it in.
Bitcoin Capital North. Bitcoin Capital North. That's what we're trying to put that name on it. The tagline.